Welcome to the Anthroposcreen YouTube channel. In this video, I will make an ethical argument that building your wealth is actually an ethical endeavor. Not only that, I'm going to show you exactly how you can build your wealth using exclusively ethical investment sources. And all of this is based on personal experience. So strap in, buckle up, and if nothing else, enjoy the music. For those of you who have seen my previous videos, you're gonna know that I don't have any faith in religion. And I won't be framing this argument from a religious perspective, but I do absolutely love this sentiment from Jesus, and I think it's super relevant to the video. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. And one of the main questions we're going to be trying to answer here is it possible to even have ethical wealth? And naturally, our first step here should be to define what is wealth before we can talk about the ethics around wealth. And net wealth is just whatever assets you have, subtracting all the debt that you have. So two examples of assets would be a house or property would be an asset if you own it, and investments and savings are also assets. Any kind of debt that you could have is loans like car loans and house loans and student loans and credit card debt. In order to figure out your net wealth, you just subtract the debt from the assets. So for example, if you had $200,000 in assets and $100,000 in loans, then your net wealth would be 200,000 minus 100,000, so 100,000. I'll be framing this entire video around the concept of wealth rather than the concept of income, because as we'll see, wealth is a much more important measurement of your financial well-being. My argument for ethical wealth stems from my Survivalist Utilitarian principles, which I outlined in this Meaning of Life video, which was the first video that I released on this channel. My philosophy is a utilitarian ethics where our goal should be to maximize our chances of survival. We should do this on the societal level, so we should be maximizing the chances of survival of our entire species and of our civilization. But I also make the argument that you should maximize your chances of survival as an individual and for your entire family. And in our current society, wealth is necessary to survive as an individual and as a family. I think regardless of your principles, most ethical belief systems should necessitate that you do take care of yourself and you do take care of your family. And if those aren't part of your ethical principles, then I would be skeptical about whether they are a good foundation to work from. We'll unpack this more as we go. George Carlin, in what I think was one of the best stand-up performances ever performed by anyone, once said that it's called the American Dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. My story is really a story about the American Dream, but it's the American Dream propped up by the Canadian Social Democratic welfare state. I was born into a facade of wealth. My father was a contractor who owned 3 houses in America, which are now all worth over $1 million each. He also owned a house in Toronto, which is now worth over $1 million, and he had a condo overseas. However, he was a very reckless person who had multiple wives and a bunch of kids. And when I was 5, my parents separated. At 7, our father disappeared in his typical, very reckless fashion and didn't help support us in any way after that point. I estimate during this interval from when I was born until I was 7 years old, we were probably somewhere around the 25th percentile in terms of net worth in America. I don't actually know what percentile we were in, but I'll explain later why I thought we were in the 25th percentile. At the age of 7, with my father disappeared, my mother and her 3 kids all moved into government housing in Canada. And over this time, my mother built a new life and a new living to support her 3 kids. By the time I was 13, my mother found a way to buy a house out of Toronto that was affordable for her. I'm also estimating what our wealth was in this interval as well. I really don't know what sort of financial situation my parents had, but I do know that we were probably pretty poor based on, things like what kind of food we were eating and what kind of clothing and what we could afford. Over this time, I did graduate high school, and at the age of 20, I decided to study philosophy in university. When I graduated with that degree, it was directly into the housing crash and recession that we saw around 2010. I worked for a little while and then went back to school to study engineering with the goal of working in the renewable energy industry. I spent most of my 20s as a student living off of government student loans. When I graduated around the age of 30, the Canadian renewable energy sector was crashing for reasons that I explained in the climate politics video. And by necessity, I moved back to America to work in the renewable energy industry there. I started in an entry-level position and worked my way up over a decade. And because I was so used to saving money as a student, I easily paid off my Canadian student loans by the age of 35, which had over the years accumulated to 70,000 Canadian dollars. After my student loans were paid off, my assets started to build up because I still was not spending a lot of money, and I made certain investments that in my late 30s would absolutely blow up and propel me from the bottom quartile of wealth in the United States up into the upper middle class, above the 75th percentile. In this time, as I was accumulating more and more wealth, I decided to buy a house and eventually paid off the entire mortgage for reasons I'll also explain later. I don't think it's very realistic to expect your wealth to go from the bottom quartile to the upper middle class in less than 5 years, but I do think it's possible to make that move over time, as I'll explain later. By the way, I did this with absolutely no financial help from my parents. I was reacquainted with my father as an adult and learned more about his financial situation in conversations that I had with him over the years. One of the things that hurt my father was that I had a half-sister from a different mother who lived in America. And unfortunately, before I was born, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And this is a quintessentially American story because my father said he spent large sums of money trying to treat his daughter, naturally, and also invested a lot of time in trying to nurse her back to health, but was unfortunately unsuccessful. But I won't pretend that this single event completely ruined my father's finances. Probably also had to do with the fact that he had many different kids with many different women. He also never paid his taxes and used to joke about the fact that he owed the American government over $200,000. But by the time I met him, he was too old to work and had no money to his name, essentially. During this time, he would joke that when I die, you could have my wheelbarrow. He did die in 2015, and I never even got his wheelbarrow. As someone who was raised for most of my childhood in pretty extreme poverty, I wanted to express my nuanced position on what that was like, because I do see a lot of accuracy in Nietzsche's statement that whatever doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. I do think that my childhood helped prepare me for adult life in ways that people who were more privileged probably were not as prepared for. That said, I also think that as parents, we do have an obligation to try our best to provide our kids with a healthy and thriving childhood. I do not recommend intentionally raising children in extreme poverty. For the remainder of the video, I'm going to outline the path to wealth accumulation and outline it in terms of these major milestones, including the debt phase, the asset accumulation phase, the part in your wealth journey where your passive income can become more than your earned income, and then some people will even reach a final phase of philanthropy where you have so much money it only makes sense to give it away. You can't spend it fast enough. At some point along this journey, you're also going to want to purchase property, and I'll talk about when that makes sense as well. Before we continue, this is a friendly reminder to like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment below, and if you really love my videos, consider joining the Patreon. In order to build your wealth, you need to be able to accumulate savings each and every month. And the recipe for this is really simple. The amount of savings you have each month is just equal to the total income that you have for that month minus any expenses you have for that month. So for example, if your income is $4,000 a month and your expenses are $3,000 a month, you can save $1,000 a month. And we'll talk about what to do with that money later. Now let's look at income and expenses and see how both of those categories align with ethics. So we can think of a lot of different income sources, and I just generated this somewhat random list of different occupations that we could work at to generate income. And I organized them by average salary, under 50,000, 50 to 100,000, 100 to 200,000, and above 200 American dollars per year here on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I organized the different occupations into different ethical categories. So there are unethical jobs, there are wasteful jobs, there are neutral jobs that just fulfill our basic needs, there are jobs that help society in certain ways, and there are jobs that actually help save the planet. And I don't mean to say that every person who does any given occupation here is ethically in these categories. I just made an effort to generalize for each occupation. So for example, a criminal defense lawyer, I know there are a lot of really well-meaning criminal defense lawyers. It is an absolutely essential occupation, but we all know that there are some criminal defense lawyers who represent certain clients that are guilty, and they do a really good job of ensuring that the criminal who they are defending is not held accountable. So in the unethical category, I mostly included certain industries like the fossil fuel industry or health insurance in the United States. Wasteful industries I included are like a plastic surgeon, for example, who only helps people who are just trying to improve the way they look a little bit more. That would be something I would consider wasteful. Commercial airlines and cruise ships are industries that emit a lot of carbon emissions and pollution just for people to go on vacation. So I would categorize those as wasteful. I do know, for example, that there are plastic surgeons that will help people who are in really bad accidents or have all sorts of other useful services. So again, I'm not saying that everyone in that occupation is providing a wasteful service to society. Things that I thought were neutral or basic needs is like if you're a upper management person at a grocery store chain, a truck driver, construction laborer, fast food workers, these are all basic services. occupations that help society, I said were doctors, nurses, firefighters, teachers, and home health care. All of them help take care of people in society. And then the industry that I really outlined as saving the planet is anyone who's working in clean tech. And if you watch my climate politics video, you can see a breakdown of how certain technologies like solar, wind energy, electric cars, building efficiency, and all sorts of other technologies are agreed upon as really awesome solutions to the climate crisis. Also important to note that a business owner could fall anywhere on this salary scale or income scale, and they could also fall anywhere on this ethical scale. I also looked at expense reduction opportunities so that we can reduce the amount of money that we spend each month, and all of these are either ethical or neutral opportunities. So I looked at the average expense that Americans pay per year, and I looked at how much the new expense could be if we took advantage of certain expense reduction opportunities, and then looked at the total savings that we would see if we implemented some of these changes. And so let's look at car ownership, for example, or transportation. So car ownership is the by far biggest area of opportunity because the average American spends $12,297 on car ownership each year when you account for all of the different expenses associated with car ownership. One huge opportunity, and I know this isn't available to everyone, but you can switch to public transportation or use a bicycle and get rid of your car, sell your car, or never own a car. And the annual expense, if you are using public transportation or a bicycle, I estimated at $500 per year. The total savings there would be $11,797. And one of the things I did in this row is I looked at how much the savings would be as a percent of the median salary in America. So I used $63,000 as the median salary, and it actually might be a little bit lower than that because I'm not accounting for taxes. But we're looking at almost $12,000 here in possible savings as a percent of the average salary is almost 20%. So that's an enormous opportunity. People are spending so much of each month's income just to have their own personal automobile. And it's pretty wild to me too that car ownership is this symbol of wealth. But when you really think about it, the people who are spending the most on their luxury cars or expensive cars are probably a lot less wealthy than people who are riding around on a bicycle or taking public transportation. It's one of those completely ass-backwards aspects of common societal thought that really blow my mind. Side note, if you are wondering if I practice what I preach here, I did buy my first car at age 37, which, as you can see, is a time when I was already starting to accumulate a large amount of wealth. This decision was the worst financial decision I ever made because I bought the car new and sold it for 40% of the purchase price 5 years later. And I currently don't have a car, which is helping me sustain my current level of wealth. If you do absolutely need to purchase a car, you can reduce the expense by buying a 5-year-old car rather than purchasing a car brand new, since it is very common for a car to depreciate in value by 50% in the first 5 years. For decades before I bought the car, I primarily commuted by bicycle, and I lived in very cold places where it would be -20 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. And I also lived in extremely hot places where the temperature would exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. Another expense category opportunity is food. For example, the average American eats out 6 times per week. And that really adds up with a total annual expense of 4,000 American dollars. Let's say you are a person who eats out 6 times a week and you reduce that to only 1 time per week. I divided 4,000 by 6 and your annual eating out expense would be reduced to $700 with a $3,300 savings, which is 5% of the median salary. Also important to note here is that there's a lot of waste associated with eating out, so you would be reducing a lot of waste in terms of packaging. So it is not an ethically neutral decision here. Another pretty big category where people can reduce their expenses is in credit card interest payments. So the average American pays credit card companies $1,000 per year because at the end of every month, they're not paying off their credit cards entirely. If you can change your habits so that you have auto pay set up on your credit cards and the entire balance of your credit card is paid off at the end of each month, you would pay $0 towards the credit card company each month, save that complete $1,000, and that is 2% of the typical American salary. You might look at this and say, easier said than done, but let's say you eliminate your car ownership expenses, paying off your credit card would be a lot easier to do each month. Another category that I thought would be interesting to note is in clothing. So the average American spends $500 a year having a larger wardrobe than they might need, and the total amount that the average American spends is $500. If you were to shift instead to a more minimalist approach to how often you buy clothes and thrifting your clothes instead, you could reduce the total annual expense to just $100 a year, saving $400 per year. I also think this is a more ethical category because I know a lot of fast fashion companies use sweatshop labor, and there's an entire video about the fast fashion impact on the environment that I would recommend. And if you buy your clothes at a thrift store instead, a lot of thrift stores are actually charities. And so when you are purchasing from that thrift store, you are contributing to a charity sometimes. So the total amount of savings just from these 4 different opportunities is $16,497, which is 25% of the typical American salary. For more information on these topics and how to save money, there are a few really good sources. You could look at Mr. Money Mustache. If you Google financial independence, retire early, FIRE, this is an entire movement of people who look at cutting expenses and saving money to try and retire at a very early age instead of what they would say is wasting our entire lives working and spending way more than we need to. One of my favorite YouTubers who seems to embrace the FIRE philosophy but is also a dedicated minimalist is Timothy Ward. If you want more information on how destructive certain parts of our economy are in regards to climate change, I highly recommend the Climate Town channel. And Climate Town, City Nerd, and Not Just Bikes have all done really phenomenal videos talking about the car society and just how ridiculous and expensive our obsession with cars is and how that came to be over time. If you ensure that your income is higher than expenses and you accumulate savings, you can use that to eliminate debt. Once the debt that you have is eliminated, like student loans and credit card debt or even a mortgage, that's when I recommend focusing on asset accumulation. In order to understand the importance of assets and growth, it's really important to understand the concept of inflation. Every year, the value of the American dollar becomes less and less because of inflation. Usually, the prices of things in general increase by about 2% per year. Some years, inflation is a lot worse than other years, but generally the rate of inflation is usually around 2%. As the dollar becomes less and less valuable, your purchasing power also becomes less and less valuable. So, $100,000 in 2005 has the same purchasing power as $166,000 does now. In other words, $100,000 is worth 40% less now than it was about 20 years ago. So when we talk about accumulating assets, we're primarily interested in finding assets that increase in value at a rate that's higher than inflation. Otherwise, the value of what you own is quickly depreciating over time. If you accumulate money by saving with lower expenses than your income, and you put it in a place that doesn't really generate interest, which a lot of people do, this is not necessarily a better ethical decision than investing it in assets. For example, if you kept the money that you saved in cash and hid it under your mattress, the interest rate is 0%, so you're losing value every year as inflation devalues the money year after year. I suppose if you do this, you're not hurting anybody, but it is quite risky because someone could find that cash and steal it easier than if it were in a bank account. If you keep that cash in a checking account, the interest is 0%. So you're still losing value over time. And if you keep the cash in a traditional savings account, the maximum interest rate now there is 0.5%. And you're still losing value over time compared to what the annual inflation rate is. A checking account and a savings account is not ethically neutral. When you keep money in a bank, the bank does not just keep that money in your account. They have the ability to lend your money to other agents. So, for example, they might lend your money to other people in the form of loans. They might lend the money to commercial or industrial businesses. When the bank is lending your money, they are collecting a much higher interest than what they're paying you, especially in a checkings account, but definitely more than what they're paying you in a traditional savings account. And the bank might be lending your money to commercial or industrial corporations that are working in unethical places. A good alternative that you could consider is keeping your money in a credit union, which is not for profit, and all of the profits generated by a credit union are distributed back to its members. Let's talk a little bit about the interest that you can generate on your assets. We know that a bank savings account gives you 0.5% interest on your cash each year. Our goal is to try and maximize that interest to avoid losing value over the years. If you are able to find an investment that gives you a 5% compound annual growth rate, this is what it looks like. The light blue is simple earnings, where in the first year, let's say you have $100,000. With 5% interest, you're going to generate $5,000 in interest. With compound annual growth, you are gaining interest on your initial amount invested, but the earnings that you got in that first year are also going to generate interest. You are going to earn 5% interest on the $5,000 you earned in the first year. So this green amount is compound earnings. So if you had $100,000 with a 5% CAGR, over 20 years, you would generate almost double the amount of your initial investment. If you are able to find an investment with a 10% CAGR, you would almost triple the amount of your initial investment in a matter of 20 years. Now that we understand the basic concept of inflation, Let's talk about more realistic circumstances. So these graphs account for annual inflation, but they also account for the fact that you are not going to just initially invest $100,000. You're also going to be making monthly contributions from your income. So in this case, we have a 5% CAGR, and let's assume you can contribute $1,000 every month to your savings, but also inflation is going to be harming your asset this entire time. In this example with 5% CAGR, you have $100,000 on your initial investment, and after 20 years, with the $1,000 monthly contributions, you would generate assets worth $500,000 based on our current purchasing power. So you'd be able to buy 5 times as much stuff as you could 20 years ago. If you are able to generate a 10% compound annual growth rate and contribute $1,000 monthly, the amount of assets that you're accumulating is even higher. So starting at $100,000, after 20 years, you would have the purchasing power of over $1 million. So this is where we need to focus on the compound annual growth rate and understand how that interplays with how your assets will look over time. I'm about to talk about my recommended ethical investments, but before I do want to mention that Islamic banking exists, and it's very intriguing to me. I love the concept of it, but I don't have much experience putting my assets in an Islamic bank, partially because I'm not a Muslim, although I doubt that they would turn down your money if you're not Muslim. Islamic banking has a multi-trillion-dollar market share, so it's pretty huge. And I suppose according to Islam, interest is haram or unethical. So they have a prohibition on interest. Instead of earning interest, they believe in profit and loss sharing. Also, based on their religious principles, they avoid certain unethical investments, including gambling, alcohol, and tobacco. Although, from what I can tell from my research, they don't avoid investing in fossil fuels, which is a big preoccupation of mine. This is the full list of assets that I recommend accumulating in order of recommendation at the current moment in time. So how we would read this is I put all the different asset classes along the x-axis, and I rank them from first place all the way down to 11th place, with the first place being municipal bonds, the second place being the S&P 500, the third place being a property with no mortgage as your primary residence, the fourth place being treasury bonds, the fifth place being high yield savings, the sixth place being individual stocks, the seventh place being exchange traded funds, the eighth place being investment property, the ninth place being gold, the 10th place being mutual funds, and the last place is crypto. My rank is based on a variety of factors, including the annual return, the ethical potential, how easy it is to understand the value of the asset and the risk of loss, and how the asset performs in different circumstances, including like a good stock market, a bad stock market, or a recession, a depression, and the worst case scenario in my mind, which is a full-on global collapse of society. Let's start by looking at my number one ranked asset, which is municipal bonds. With municipal bonds, you're essentially lending your money to a city or some kind of local service, and that entity is paying you an interest rate that should be around the general interest rates that we'll talk about in a second. Right now, you can buy municipal bonds for about 3 to 4%, depending on the credit rating of the entity. But one of the coolest things about municipal bonds in America is that if you lend to a local entity in the same state as you, some states won't tax you on the interest that's gained. So whatever interest rate that you're getting, because it's not taxed, you could think of it as being even higher than what it appears to be. The ethical potential of a municipal bond is very high because you can lend to entities that perform key services in society, like the water utility or the electrical utility, or even the city in general. I think this sort of asset is very consistent with someone who might have socialist principles and just wants to invest in their local community. In terms of transparency of understanding how the investment works and how the value increases or decreases over time, it is based on locked-in set rates. And the transparency around interest rates is super clear. These are the interest rates in America over the last about 80 years. And the interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve increases and decreases interest rates in response to economic recessions and depressions, so they can lower interest rates to invigorate the economy, or when there is inflation, they can increase interest rates to slow the economy and slow inflation as it gets out of control. And you can see down here where we have inflationary environments, they increase the interest rates to try and reduce the inflation. We did see some pretty serious inflation rates in the last 5 years, and as a result, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rates. In the last 20 years, we've seen some unprecedentedly low interest rates. So when the interest rates are this low, the benefit of investing in any sort of municipal bonds or treasuries or corporate bonds or contract deposits become much less enticing and would fall far down on my rank of best assets. But you can buy municipal bonds that are locked in over 5, 10, 20, 30-year periods, and so you can guarantee your compound annual growth rate of that asset over very long periods of time. The risk of loss on municipal bonds is usually pretty low, and you can see the credit rating of the thing that you are lending money to. Bull market performances, where the stock market is doing really well, municipal bonds don't usually do well compared to other investments, and people are less likely to invest in bonds at that time. Recession performance is really great compared to other assets, and money starts pouring back into bonds during weak stock market periods. The value of the bond does fluctuate over time, but if you plan to hold it throughout the entirety of the bond's life cycle, so if it's 30 years and you hold it for the entire 30 years, you are guaranteed to get your initial investment back as long as the entity that you're lending to doesn't go bankrupt. In a global collapse, most of the assets we're talking about are going to become completely worthless, including municipal bonds. My second favorite asset is the S&P 500, and the annual return of the S&P 500 is really amazing at 10%. What is the S&P 500? It is the Standard & Poor's top 500 companies, and if you're interested in buying this in a brokerage account, you would look for the ticker symbol SPY. What it is the leading 500 companies in America. So you're primarily looking at buying American companies, and they're not weighted equally. They're distributed by the market cap weight of the company's stock. So right now, if you buy the S&P 500, the biggest investment you're making is in NVIDIA. And if you spent $100 on the S&P 500, $7.61 of your $100 investment would be going towards NVIDIA. After that, it's Apple. After that, it's Microsoft. After that is Amazon. When we're talking about ethics, I would like to avoid investing in fossil fuel companies. So one of my favorite index fund is SPYX, which avoids fossil fuel companies. So you can see that the 14th largest investment in the S&P 500 is ExxonMobil. And if you buy SPYX, you are avoiding investing money into that corporation. You can get a sense of whether the S&P 500 is overvalued and very risky or undervalued by looking at the price to earnings ratio. If you're talking about price to earnings ratio in an individual stock, you're basically taking the total market cap of that corporation stock, the price, and dividing it by the annual earnings of the stock at that given moment, which is the E, so price divided by earnings. Value investors typically consider a price to earnings ratio under 20 as a great investment. So you're buying that investment at a good value if you buy it when it's under 20. You can apply the same principle to the entire S&P 500. So when the S&P 500 was under 10 in 1980, that would be a great time to buy as much of the S&P 500 as you can. The price of the S&P 500 in the last decade has been very high, and you can mitigate your losses of buying into the S&P 500 by dollar cost averaging into the S&P 500 over the years. So if you just kept buying the S&P 500 since the year 2000, you'd sometimes be buying it at a high price, but other times you'd be buying it at a more reasonable price, and the value of the S&P 500 over this time would continuously go up. You can see when the price to earnings ratio of the S&P 500 was really high, it usually corresponds with major crashes of the S&P 500 over the last 25 years. So during the dot-com bubble, where technology stocks were shooting up super high in price, even though there were no earnings generated by those internet companies, the price to earnings ratio shot up to unprecedented levels, and there was a major crash after that. There was also a major crash around the US housing bubble burst, and there was a pretty significant crash during the pandemic when a lot of people had stimulus money coming to them and not much to spend it on. So people were investing in the stock market at higher rates than we'd seen historically, and the price to earnings ratio of the S&P 500 shot up really high. Another thing to think about with the S&P 500 is that it is intimately tied with the gross domestic product of the American economy. So the GDP growth rate is often between 2 and 6% any given year. But in years where the GDP growth rate was 0 or negative, there were often significant dips in the S&P 500. So you see that in the 70s and the 80s, in and around 2007, 2008 during the housing crash, and during the pandemic. And one thing to think about is that no empire lasts forever. And right now we are living during the American Empire. People are already speculating about the rise of China and India replacing American economic dominance. And if that does occur, what do we think is going to happen to the S&P 500? This might not be as great of an investment as the American Empire falls. So when you're buying the S&P 500, you are going to invest in certain companies you don't like. I don't like Apple and I don't like Amazon. They're two of the main investments in the S&P 500. I don't like them because I don't like how they treat workers, and I don't think they add a lot to society. I think they harm society in certain ways. It is somewhat easy to understand whether you're buying the S&P 500 at a high or low price thanks to price-to-earnings ratio. The risk of loss is medium, since we do know that it does come down sometimes, and right now the risk is pretty high because the PE ratio is very high compared to what it's been over the last 100 years. In bull markets, where the stock market is doing well, it's going to increase at fantastic rates. During recession and depression, it's very risky, but it's a great time to buy, and during a global collapse, it would become worthless. My third favorite asset is buying a property that you intend to be your primary residence for the rest of your life, and you pay off that property and have absolutely no mortgage on that property. With property in America, the usual rate of return is 4%, but that doesn't really matter because you're not planning to sell that property. At any point, you're just planning to live there for your entire life. The ethical potential, I said, is high because everyone needs property. I don't think you can blame anyone for just buying a property that they can live in. It's a basic need. I will talk about the home price versus income on property as a way to see if a property is overvalued or undervalued, but if you don't plan to sell your property anytime soon, it's irrelevant whether the price increases or decreases. The risk of loss is very low if you pay off the entire mortgage and you plan to hold it for your entire life. Also, if you plan to pay off your entire mortgage, there's very little risk involved in losing this asset in all stock market situations, and even in a global collapse, it's probably one of the more valuable assets that you can have, even though in a collapse people might not respect property rights and they might just try to take the property that you have from you. But of all these different asset classes, it's the one that holds the strongest. Treasuries, bonds, and I didn't mention contract deposits here, are all kind of similar concepts. With treasuries, you're lending money to the American government. With corporate bonds, you're lending money to corporations. With contract deposits, you're lending money to a bank, and all of them can guarantee the annual return of whatever the interest rate is set by the Federal Reserve. I said the ethical potential here is medium. I honestly think the only bond that really interests me in this category are treasuries, where you're lending to the American government. But the ethical aspect here is you don't really choose what the American government does with that money, and they do some really unethical things, especially during times of war. I think corporate bonds and contract deposits are pretty unethical, although you can select companies that have a good credit rating and maybe do less harm to society. Transparency is great, as we talked about the locked-in rates already. The risk of loss is usually very low if you pick entities with a good credit rating. Bull market performance is mediocre. Recession performance is super safe, and the depression performance is medium. But in the event of a global collapse, they will also be worthless. A high yield savings account is an account offered by a bank that has a higher interest rate than what you would see in a traditional savings account that's usually pretty close to whatever interest rate the Federal Reserve sets. The ethical potential of this is medium because it offers the same visibility on what you're investing in as any other bank savings account. The transparency is less good than bonds because you cannot lock in the rates that you have. So whatever the Federal Reserve decides to do with interest rates is what's going to impact your savings that are in a high yield savings account. So if the Federal Reserve drives the interest rate back lower than the rate of inflation, your money might depreciate if the rate becomes low enough. The risk of loss of a high yield savings account is extremely low. In America, most of these accounts are FDIC insured, meaning the government is ensuring that your money never disappears. The risk is actually a lot lower than it is with bonds. Compared to the S&P 500, it's not going to perform well in a strong market, but in a recession and depression, it's pretty safe and probably performs better than a lot of investments. In a global collapse, I think it would also be worthless. Now let's look at individual stocks and exchange traded funds, which are lower recommended investments based on my ranking. Individual stocks are pretty cool, but most people do not do a good job of picking individual stocks. So we're talking about like buying individual companies, like making the choice to buy Nvidia or making the choice to buy whatever company. The average return of individual stock pickers is 2% compared to the S&P 500, 10%. It's not very great. However, the ethical potential is pretty high if you seek out certain companies that you think add value to society. It's relatively transparent on how to evaluate whether you're buying these companies at a right time. And there's probably more potential here than even the S&P 500 if you know what you're doing. The risk of loss here is extremely high because a company can go completely bankrupt and your investment can go to zero in any market. In bull markets, sometimes no matter what stock you're buying, you're going to see an amazing return on your investment. But in other markets, most stocks are risky and dangerous, and in a global collapse, they would all be worthless. An exchange traded fund is just a bucket of stocks. So the S&P 500 is actually an exchange traded fund. It's just an amazing exchange traded fund. The ethical potential can be really amazing here. I've dabbled in solar energy and wind energy ETFs over time, but I'm going to talk about individual stocks and exchange traded funds in more detail in my next video. The transparency of ETFs in terms of whether you're buying it at a high price or a low price is a lot more difficult to calculate. I think the risk of loss is a lot higher than the S&P 500, but it's always there when you're investing in the stock market, and the performance in different market circumstances are similar to individual stocks. My 8th favorite asset class is investment properties. So you could think of your own property as an investment property if you don't plan to keep it for the long term, or you could look at investment properties that you can buy and then rent out and try to earn profit on that investment. The annual return on investment properties has been 8% in recent years, which appears good. The ethical potential is medium. If you are a good landlord and you take care of your tenants in decent ways, then I don't think you're really harming society that much, but it's also easy to be a really unethical slum landlord type of person. In terms of transparency on whether you're buying a home at a time when it is overvalued or undervalued, home price versus income is the best way I could think to evaluate that. This is the home price ratio to median household income in America over the last 90 years. As you can see, from the mid-60s to the late 90s, the ratio of home price to the median income was a lot less than it has been in the last 25 years. What that means is it was easier to buy a house for the typical American before the year 2000. After the year 2000, we saw a rise in the ratio. It became very extreme during the housing bubble and then quickly collapsed over a span of 5 years, but it's been increasing since 2010. And now the ratio is higher than it was during the housing bubble. Some people might look at this and expect another crash. However, I think you also have to consider the factor of income inequality in the United States, which has been increasing ever since the year 1980. If there is a large percentage of income inequality and the top 1% wealthiest people in America in terms of income are getting richer and richer, they are buying more and more property. So it is possible that the typical price of real estate could become out of reach for most Americans without crashing back down, because the richest segment of society has so much money that it almost doesn't matter how much income the average American is making. In short, I'm not sure if home prices in America are going to come crashing back down or not, because the income inequality problem is getting worse and worse as time goes by. This is why I have the risk of loss down as medium. Bull market performance, when everyone's doing well financially, I think investment properties usually do well. But in a recession and depression, I think property as an investment becomes very risky and dangerous. If rich people's investments in the S&P 500 and other assets crash, they might be forced to sell their property, and the entire real estate market could come crashing down with the S&P 500. During a global collapse, investment property might be completely worthless if the concept of property ownership disappears alongside the collapse. Gold, mutual funds, and crypto are three assets that I do not recommend investing in, which is why they're ranked with the lowest ranked numbers. I'm surprised when I was looking at gold's annual return at 10%. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but if it is, it's a pretty great investment in terms of returns. However, I rate gold really low because of the ethical potential. I think gold mining is extremely damaging to the environment, and gold doesn't offer too much in terms of benefit for society. The transparency around gold is also very weak, which is why I don't like purchasing it as an asset. It's hard to understand when gold is overvalued or undervalued. It seems just to respond to the stock market. As people are worried more and more around the stock market, the value of gold increases more and more. I think the risk of loss is medium, in a sense that gold seems to consistently increase with inflation, or apparently faster than inflation. Bull market performance of gold is mediocre. It's really valuable though when you're in a recession or depression. It seems to hold its value. And in a global collapse, gold would be mostly worthless unless you're figuring out a way to use it to build things or trade as barter in a collapsed society. But I think both of those benefits are pretty limited. Mutual funds are very similar to exchange traded funds. It's just a bucket of assets. Some mutual funds I think include bonds in the bucket as well. The annual return of mutual funds are 7%, but mutual funds are just a group of assets that are organized by people and bankers who are trying to produce a good return on investment. The ethical potential is medium because I think there are some mutual funds that focus on ethical sources. The transparency is difficult because it's a big bucket of stocks and it's hard to keep track of whether all of the different assets are overvalued or undervalued. Risk of loss is probably similar to the S&P 500 and other stocks. Bull market performance is probably usually great, but it depends. And the recession and depression performance is usually risky or dangerous. In a global collapse, just like other stocks and ETFs, they would become worthless. Finally, crypto is my lowest ranking asset. The annual return for Bitcoin has been phenomenal at 80% over the last 10 or 20 years, although I saw a lot of variations in the different numbers that are online. The ethical potential of most cryptocurrencies is really low. It's low from my perspective because cryptocurrencies require a huge amount of energy to generate and trade. And this is happening at a time when society really needs to figure out how to reduce the amount of electricity we use. Transparency is extremely weak for cryptocurrency. There are some ways to guess whether cryptocurrency is going to increase or decrease, but unlike the S&P 500, where you can look at the price to earnings ratio, municipal bonds where you can look at rates, and property where you can look at the home price to income ratio, there's really no objective gauge to tell whether a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is overpriced or underpriced. The risk of loss then is extremely high. We've seen dramatic swings in the cryptocurrency prices, including Bitcoin. I will admit that in a bull market, cryptocurrencies seem to do amazing, especially Bitcoin, but we don't know how cryptocurrencies are going to perform in a serious recession or a depression, because Bitcoin hasn't been around long enough to give us an indication of how that would work out. In a global collapse, I'm pretty sure all cryptocurrencies would be completely worthless. They only exist online, and I think during a global collapse, there would be a good chance that the entire internet would disappear. When it comes to assets, diversification is the name of the game. The goal should be to distribute your wealth into different asset categories to help protect it from crashes in any of the individual categories. This is my asset distribution from the year 2017 until now in 2026. The green is high yield savings, the pink is property equity, the maroon is bonds, blue is stocks that are not Tesla stock, and baby blue is Tesla stock. I'll talk about this more in my next video, but Tesla stock is really the main source of my current wealth. It is the primary way in which I moved from being in the bottom 25% of wealth in the United States into the upper middle class. So in 2017, I had started building a really large position in Tesla stock, and the value of the stock increased immensely, especially into the year 2020 and 2021. I was also investing in other stocks, but partially because the growth of Tesla was so insane, it dominated my entire portfolio. In 2020, I also bought a property, and then in 2023, I paid off the entire mortgage. So as a percentage of my wealth, it was a very large percentage. However, I ended up moving and decided to sell the house rather than rent it out. And most of that money has gone into my high yield savings, which I've been dollar cost averaging slowly back into the stock market. But I also have been buying a lot of bonds in preparation for interest rate decreases in the United States. My asset distribution is not and has not been ideal. I would eventually like to own a property again, but I would be more reluctant to buy a property unless I wanted to settle down in that place for the long term. And when I do buy a property, I want there to be absolutely no mortgage. Of the remaining wealth that I have after I purchase a property, I would want my cash levels to be about 10% to 30% of my non-property assets. When the stock market is overvalued, it's good to build up higher cash reserves in preparation for there being a market crash. And then when the market does crash and stocks and ETFs are at a low value, it's good to deploy as much cash into the market as you can at that point. In regards to non-cash assets, I like to use the rule where your age should tell you how much of your assets should be bonds. So the target for me, because I'm around 40 years old, would be to have about 40% of my assets to be bonds. And as I get older, you want to have a higher and higher proportion of bonds so that your wealth is more and more secure. The remaining 60% of my deployed cash should be in stocks. And I'm currently taking the perspective of putting 50% of that money into the S&P 500 and the remaining 50% in individual stocks. However, I do not recommend for most people to buy stocks. I'll talk more about that in my next video. How would this work in reality? So let's say I bought a house and I had paid off the mortgage, and let's say that the remainder of my wealth was $130,000. Right now, I think it would be good to keep $30,000 in a high yield savings account because the S&P 500 PE ratio is very high. That would leave me with $100,000 invested. Of those $100,000, I would put $40,000 in bonds and $60,000 would be in the S&P 500 in stocks. Of those $60,000, I would put $30,000 in the S&P 500 and $30,000 in individual stocks. A lot of people don't recommend paying off your property mortgage right away because they think that you can get a better return on investment in the S&P 500 than the interest rate on your mortgage. So let's say the interest rate on your mortgage is 4%, you could get a better return on investment in the S&P 500, which is closer to 10%. So over time, you'd probably be better off. However, I don't like the idea of potentially losing my entire house if there was a massive stock market crash and depression. If you do have a mortgage on your house, you don't entirely own the house. It is still owned by the bank, and if you are unable to pay the mortgage payments, they could eventually seize the property from you. I like to be prepared for the worst case scenario so that I wouldn't end up with nothing in the event of a really bad economic crash. In the financial journey that I am outlining here, after you start accumulating assets, there is a point at which your passive income will be greater than whatever income you're earning from your traditional occupation. This is a phenomenal milestone in the wealth building process. So, for example, the average salary in America is about $60,000 US. Let's say for a moment that your entire asset portfolio compound annual growth rate is 4%. At what point does your passive income become greater than your salary? Well, if you have $1,500,000, which would put you in the top 10% wealthiest Americans in the country, then your annual gains would be $60,000, which means that your annual return on investment would be the same as the average salary in America. As your wealth grows beyond this point, you eventually reach the stage where I think ethically there is an obligation to commit most of your wealth to philanthropic causes. Let's consider Peter Singer's thought experiment around a drowning child. Imagine for a moment that you're walking through a park on the way to your job. On your walk through the park, you see a child in a pond in the park who is drowning in a fairly shallow pool of water. Let's say the pool of water is 4 feet deep and you are 6 feet tall and the child is 3 feet tall and drowning in the water. Peter Singer says that we would all agree that the person who is walking to work would have a moral obligation to save the drowning child because saving the child is a very small expense compared to saving the child's life. For you, the only inconvenience is that you might destroy whatever clothes you're wearing. Your shoes would get wet, your pants would get wet, the rest of your clothes might be slightly damaged, but you would be saving the child's life. You'd also have to go home and change before you go to work, which might make you a little bit late. For Peter Singer, this is an analogy to how we should think about using our income to donate to charity. Peter Singer thinks the majority of our income should be spent on charity as long as it's not inconveniencing us too much, especially if you live in a wealthy part of the world. This is where my survivalist utilitarianism varies from traditional happiness-based utilitarianism. With a focus on an individual and their family's survival, I argue that it's important to establish the basic needs of you and your family before allocating most of your resources to charity or philanthropy. As someone who is focused on the survival of the human species and looking at the serious risks that society could collapse and knowing the risk of economic recessions and depressions, it's easier to make an argument that people should retain their assets up until a certain point of wealth. At what point is a person morally obligated to donate a significant amount of their funds to some sort of charity or societal cause? I would say that when you enter the top 1% of society, the moral obligation is very obvious. Let's say you have a compound annual growth rate in your portfolio of 5%. That means that every year your wealth is growing by $650,000. That is way more than any individual person or family could possibly need for survival at this point in time. So I think there is a clear argument that says that when someone becomes this wealthy, they should be deploying the majority of their wealth back into society. You could also use this money to individually build a business that doesn't exist, that addresses society's problems. But if you're not doing that, I would argue that the majority of your compound annual growth should be given back to the rest of society. It's also interesting to consider how privileged people are who are raised in the top 1% of society, especially if you were born into it. Once you understand the concept of compound annual growth, it's clear that someone who is raised into the top 1% of society could really spend their entire life doing absolutely nothing and living a very luxurious lifestyle without exerting very much effort at all in the process. They have it extremely easy. Another quick note I'd like to make on philanthropy is that I think we have an obligation to contribute our funds to certain political movements at times when there are time-sensitive opportunities to advance the political progress in society. I talk more about this in the climate politics video, but in my opinion, even if you haven't fully established your financial security, I highly recommend donating money to really great political movements that could have an enormous impact on the direction of society in a systemic way. If you haven't seen my climate apocalypse or climate collapse video, or even if you have seen the video, you might think it's bizarre that I have a total societal collapse potential outcome in consideration when I'm looking at different asset types. I realize to a lot of people this might seem irrational and unnecessary. But if you are interested in learning more about why I think it should be a consideration, I do recommend watching this video for a full breakdown of all of the scientific evidence there is that a collapse of civilization is an outcome of climate change that we should seriously consider. The conclusion of the video is that we just don't have a lot of research into the probability of a societal collapse, but I think there's enough scientists saying that there are serious concerns about the direction of humanity that we need to consider that collapse could be a worst-case scenario outcome of climate change. And an important consideration then is a question: what does wealth look like after the collapse of civilization? The majority of the different asset classes I looked at previously in this video probably wouldn't hold up in a total collapse of civilization. And I did try to brainstorm different types of assets that would be beneficial after a societal collapse. I think this merits an entire video of its own, but I'll just briefly go over some of these categories, like having a community of people that you can lean on for support during a collapse. I mentioned that having your own property would be useful, but in particular, if you have a homestead where you figure out how to generate a significant amount of food on your own property would be very beneficial. It's also very beneficial if you're near some sort of clean drinking water source that you can also use as irrigation. In a collapse of civilization, the food systems that support people currently won't be something that we can rely on going forward. So I do think that it would be good to have a store of basic necessities, like food, a seed bank that you could access later to grow different types of food and beneficial plants, and a store of medicine. You probably also want a store of clean drinking water if you don't have any on your property. Other things that would probably be useful if civilization were to completely collapse would be any sorts of tools that you could use for farming and hunting and fishing. And if you watch the collapse video, you'll see a section that is quite disturbing where Jared Diamond is talking about what collapse looked like on Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean. Civilization collapse can be extremely violent, and they say that before humans will starve, they raid. And for this reason, I think that weapons would also be something that would be useful to have so that you could protect your property. Other types of wealth include books, knowledge, and experience on how to survive on your own without the support systems of society as we currently know it. Anyway, I think this is a pretty big topic that I would like to make a separate video on someday. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that as a survivalist utilitarian, I think it's perfectly ethical to build a certain amount of wealth to ensure the security of yourself and your family as we head into very uncertain times, especially as a result of climate change. The path that I recommend to get there is to make sure that your income is greater than your expenses. We looked at certain sources of ethical income, and we looked at ethical ways in which we could reduce our expenses. By far, the biggest opportunity to reduce your expenses would be to live a car-free life, and I also recommend exploring the financial independence, retire early movement for a lot more different recommendations on how to reduce your expenses. If you are able to generate monthly savings and maximize those, you can quickly eliminate any debt that you have. Once you eliminate your debt, that's when you can start building ethical assets. The first ethical asset I would recommend acquiring, assuming that you are interested in staying in one single location for the rest of your life, would be to purchase a home and pay off the mortgage completely. Once you have a home that's completely paid off, the assets that you have, not including your home, should be distributed as follows. I recommend 10 to 30% of your wealth should be in high yield savings, and the remaining wealth should be whatever your age is as a percent in bonds. So I'm 40 years old and I should aim for 40% bonds, and the remainder should be invested in stocks. In particular, I recommend the S&P 500. So in my case, since 40% of my non-high yield savings wealth is in bonds, the remaining 60% should be invested in the S&P 500. And I especially recommend ticker symbol SPYX to avoid investing in fossil fuels. With this strategy, you should, with some patience, achieve financial freedom over time. One last note that I would like to make is that even though wealth acquisition is not unethical, and I would even say that there's a moral obligation to try to generate wealth to support yourself and your family, I do not believe that wealth is equivalent to happiness. I don't think that once you achieve a certain wealth target that you'll suddenly achieve happiness. That's certainly not how it turned out for me. When I paid off my home and had additional savings and entered the upper middle class, I didn't feel a resounding sense of happiness. I did feel a sense of relief after an entire lifetime of financial insecurity, but I had a really strange and confusing feeling once I entered into that level of wealth. The strangest thing that happened to me was my relationship with work. I suddenly didn't have the same motivation in keeping my job and making sure that everyone was happy around me at my job. I knew that I no longer needed to make income to survive in the same way that I needed it when I was in a more precarious financial situation. And it's hard to change your mentality when your entire life you've been used to struggling to survive from one day to the next. I can tell you from experience that it's also really easy to slip into an obsession over wealth generation. You can spend way too much time fixated on building more and more wealth. And in my meaning of life video on this channel, I started that video with a clip from David Foster Wallace, where he talks about how everybody worships. And one of the warnings he gives us is that if you fall into worshiping wealth, you'll never be happy and you'll never feel like you have enough. And that's how I'd like to end this video, just to remind you that wealth is not the be all and end all. Thanks for watching this video to the end. I hope you enjoyed it.